Welcome to another episode of Talking Till Dawn. I'm Martin, and I'm joined by the Laird of Dungorth, Sir Michael Whitehouse. How the heck are you, Mike?
I love that reference, Martin. Thank you so much for being the only person on the planet to use
You're
it.
welcome. Now you can say it's been done.
Yeah, I know. Thank you so much. I'm good, my friend. I'm good. How is life treating you?
I'm good, busy as you know, but pretty good all things considered. All the better for being here with you on the podcast with the epic finale to our last episode about the World's End murders and the crimes of Angus Sinclair. Well, as good as anyone can possibly feel about discussing such a harrowing case anyway.
I saw one of our listeners post something online, and they said that some of these episodes are a bit harrowing. You know, I know, I get it.
Yeah.
You know, that
You ain't seen nothing yet.
Yeah. Yeah. So apologies. I think it's just that when you're doing a podcast like this that covers macabre topics, covers true crime and covers paranormal and unexplained mysteries, you know, you're going to get some people who prefer the unexplained mysteries. You're going to get some people who prefer the true crime stuff.
Yeah.
And sometimes, you know, like some of the podcasts I listen to, you'll skip certain episodes because there's just certain things that you like and other things that you don't.
Yeah.
You know, so
I've always kind of wanted, and I think you have as well, Talking Till Dawn is slightly different to some of the things that we've done on Ghastly Tales, like the true crime things that we've done there. You've done a few things and I've done a few things. I think Talking Till Dawn has always been pitched to be a little bit more kind of challenging and a bit more, not grittier for the sake of being gritty, but not to sort of shy away from the serious consequences and more that kind of side of things rather than just like, oh, spooky. There's a bit of that as well, but it goes a little bit into the darker side of things. Not all of our episodes.
no.
But the things that we talk about on this show, I think...
I think you gaslit me, because when we first started, we were like, yeah, let's veer away from the more grisly stuff. And then I have to say, then I went and did...
a murder, the second episode that we did or something like that. Yeah.
So I gaslit myself, basically.
I don't know if we said we wouldn't do it, but I think we were debating whether to do true crime and stuff. And I think a lot of it, though, was just about finding the right tone and the right approach. But I think we found that. I think we have kind of found that way of approaching it.
Yeah, there's definitely a way to do it. Before we jump into tonight's episode, can I give a very special shout out to Graham? Now, Graham, he recommended the show to his sister Alison, or Ali, and it was just quite funny because, as it turned out, Ali was actually someone that I worked with 20 years ago in the nightclubs.
No way.
And she was listening to it and was like, oh, that's quite strange. I think I know him. And she messaged me. We had a good catch up. So a big thank you to Graham for spreading the word on the podcast, and a big thank you to Alison as well for listening.
That's pretty mad.
Yeah.
What's the chances that one of our 10 listeners happens to be someone that you know?
Do you know, it's actually the second strange coincidence with Alison, because I'm not used to calling her Alison, Ali, because we both volunteered somewhere years ago. Like, I hadn't seen her in years, and we both ended up at the same training thing together. A weird coincidence. And then I remember sitting in the building doing the training seminar, and I looked out the window, and for some reason my ex-girlfriend was standing at the window, like staring in through the window. I don't know why.
And then you realised you had no clothes on, and then you woke up in bed.
Yeah, but I always remember that being hilarious, like bumping into someone from old work and then like looking through the window and seeing the person I used to go out with when I worked there.
Yeah.
You know, it was a weird thing. Anyway, so a big thank you to Graham and Alison. Enough of my coincidences.
No, it's all good. Also, thank you. We've got a few new Patreon members, Michael. Excellent. If you'd like to join me in welcoming them to the fold. At the Nightbird level, hello to Aaron. Thanks so much, mate. And Meat Juice, who is a long-time supporter of various projects that we've been involved in over the years. Also, Stepan Dempshishin, who we gave a shout out to last month. He came on board at the Dawn Star level, which is fantastic. Great to have you guys on board. It's a wonderful help to keep a small independent show like Talking Till Dawn going.
Definitely.
If you'd like to contribute and join our little community, head on over to patreon.com/Talking Till Dawn. Or you can support us non-financially, but just as valuably, by giving us a retweet, recommending us to a friend, or writing us a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts.
For us being quite a new-ish podcast and also being a smaller podcast, like the level of support we've had from listeners has been really tremendous. So thanks to everyone.
It's great. It makes a huge difference to us. It really does. Now, tonight's episode will be a continuation of the topic from the last episode. We'll be delving deep into the grisly and disturbing background of Angus Sinclair, the man who, at the conclusion of the previous episode, had been on trial for the World's End murders, a trial that fell apart in extremely controversial circumstances. And we'll be looking at what happened in the aftermath of that failed trial. You probably should have listened to that episode before listening to this one. I'll try and call back to stuff we talked about before for anyone that hasn't listened to that, but I do recommend listening to that first, because there's parts of this, especially the finale of tonight's episode, that I can't guarantee you'll follow without at least some familiarity with what we're talking about. Like the last episode, this will involve discussion of some shocking and distressing crimes, including some crimes against children. Now, if that's something you find particularly upsetting, you know the drill. This episode may not be suitable for you. Our next topic, I think, we'll probably pick something a bit less horrific, so maybe pop back next time.
Haunted clouds.
The Sky Spitter returns.
Oh yes, please.
That out of the way, let's do this. Angus Sinclair was born in Glasgow on the 7th of June 1945 to Mary and Angus Sr. He had two much older siblings, a brother and a sister, and one younger sister who, well, we'll come back to her. They lived in the northwest of the city, St. Peter Street in Woodside, just north of what's now Junction 17 of the M8, in what would then have been called a room and kitchen, a very small two-room tenement flat. Not at all like the comfortable tenements that are the darlings of the Glasgow property market today. The ones that survive now are, by and large, the ones built for the middle class and the upper middle class of the 1890s. Much more spacious affairs. The ones that Sinclair grew up in, that probably half the city at the time grew up in, were far smaller, and the vast majority of these were bulldozed for new developments between the 50s and the 70s. We're talking parents sleeping in the living room, kids sleeping in a curtained off section of the kitchen, no indoor toilet, shared outhouses out the back, an unbelievably small space for a family of 4 or 5 to inhabit, by today's standards anyway. While Sinclair's family were poor, they were working class poor, not underclass poor. They weren't living in the depths of poverty. The property, though small, was clean and well kept and comfortably furnished. And by most accounts, Angus was born into a supportive, loving family. Not at all the cradle of mental disturbance and domestic abuse that most serial killers grow up in. But it would not be without its difficulties. While Mary was pregnant with Angus Jr., Angus Sr. began to suffer unexplained bouts of ill health. These increased both in frequency and severity over a period of quite some time, and ultimately, when young Angus is a toddler, his father is diagnosed with an aggressive form of leukemia. This left Angus Sr. unable to work, but it also meant he was able to stay at home to mind his preschool-age son, while Mary worked during the day at a tobacco shop to support the family. As a result, young Angus and his dad grew extremely close. Shortly after Angus began attending Grove Street Primary School, Angus Sr. passed away as a result of his illness. As you might expect, young Angus was greatly affected by this. He and his dad had been almost inseparable. Angus went through a period of moody and depressive episodes. I've seen a couple of sources that say he spent a short spell in a residential school of some kind, briefly, although the exact reasons are not recorded, and family members, when interviewed about it years later, couldn't recall the exact reason for that. I guess that's quite weird in itself. Maybe that was them downplaying something that we don't know about, but also, on the other hand, sending kids away to residential facilities at that time was done like almost at the drop of a hat. Yeah. It was done quite commonly. I know you probably know a lot about it because your dad was a social worker, but probably in the times before he was, in that profession, it was kind of a blanket solution used by social services for lots of things, even relatively mild issues.
There was actually, I won't name the person, but there was my aunt's father, who my dad knew. Mm-hmm. He was like the first generation of social workers. like the very first.
Yeah.
And I don't know how accurate it is, but it felt like the stories that I get told about my aunt's dad while on duty, it was like, one social worker to practically a city. Like it was ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, kids still slip through the cracks now, but like,
how could you possibly keep up in a city like Glasgow?
Yeah.
In the 50s and 60s?
Yeah. Just coming off the decline of the shipyards and the increase of poverty.
People whose parents and families been killed in the war,
Yeah.
and all kinds of issues. But I think by and large, even though he had this brief period in a residential school, he seems to have functioned within kind of quote-unquote normal spectrum of behaviour for a kid his age. He had his issues, but he wasn't like terrorising the neighbourhood or anything. Also around this time, Angus's older sister, in her late teens, fell pregnant outside of wedlock. In an era where teen pregnancy was somehow both much more common and more scandalous than it is today, Mary took on this grandchild as a daughter of her own, and so young Angus gained a wee sister, as far as he knew, though she was in fact his niece.
And it was super common as well. There was always a question in my mind about my aunt and my dad. Sometimes I wondered if, she wasn't his sister.
Right, yeah.
But had maybe been his mother.
That was always a thing, wasn't it, in that kind of time, that shame of...
Especially like when they were really young.
Uh-huh.
Just because in my dad's side of the family, he was born years later after all of the rest.
Yeah.
When my gran was 45, and that was back in the 40s. And just the relationship that they had as well, it was kind of maternal. Mm-hmm. So like I always wondered about that. I get told that it did get brought up once, but it was just kind of shot down. And if you look at the birth certificates and all that, it's like not. But then I think even that sort of stuff went on where doctors would like
tinker with the certificates and stuff.
Yeah, so just saying, point of interest, that I think that sort of thing went on all the time.
Definitely. Yeah, I think you're right. I think it was vastly common. Angus seems to have been surprisingly naive on sexual matters, as you can probably tell from that, like where babies came from. But he doted on this wee girl. He spoiled her, even. He played with her, he looked out for her, he would save up his pocket money to buy gifts for her. And perhaps unusually, given the path he would go down after this, there's no evidence that I can find of him being in any way inappropriate, cruel, or abusive towards this girl. For someone who would go on to do the things he later did, for him to be so tender and kind to this girl seems comparably strange. And that was backed up by other family members, including later by the wee girl herself when she grew up. It just seems strange to me that someone who would go on to commit terrible crimes against girls, who would go on to treat girls and women as objects to be used and discarded, would have such an apparently loving, caring, nurturing relationship with a younger sibling. But the first real antisocial problems don't seem to have manifested until Angus was approaching adolescence, about 11 or 12 years of age, and at first these just involved minor crimes of dishonesty. But even there, at first, there wasn't that much to differentiate these transgressions from those of other kids. This is a rough and tumble area. It's Glasgow in the 50s. Street gangs, crime, pretty common. He's dabbling in shoplifting. He and his pals are daring each other to sneak into places they shouldn't be and pinch things. He runs away a couple of times. There's thousands of kids his age, especially then, who had those kinds of petty crimes on the rap sheet. But Angus also, from around the age of 12, developed an absolute obsession with sex. Again, it isn't completely bananas, the idea of a young teenage boy being interested in sex.
Oh.
Far from it. He was certainly, though, in what he did at such a young age, he was sexually precocious. In a psych report carried out on him when he was 16, the psychiatrist writes, Sinclair first had sex age 13 with a girl of about the same age. That's very young. I mean, it's certainly far from ideal. Again, it's not totally outside the normal range of experience. I think in that time especially, a lot of people were doing things they shouldn't at a very young age. Kids were running kind of wild. The problem is, things didn't stay at that level. These things, both the sexual side of things and the antisocial behaviour side of things, began escalating together very quickly and in a very worrying direction. In 1959, still aged 13, he and a friend, another local boy, broke in and stole the offertory box from a local church, St. Aloysius. I think they got away with about £15 or £20 in today's money.
Was Angus Catholic?
I'm not sure, actually. That's one thing I'm not certain of.
Just because you think of it more in terms of how much more of a transgression that is.
Yeah.
If you're Catholic, to have done that
Yeah.
to what sounds like to me, I don't know, but it sounds like to me it was a chapel.
Yeah, it was the offertory box inside a church.
What I mean is a member of that, maybe not that exact church, but of the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
To do that to a chapel as opposed to a Church of Scotland or Episcopalian church, you know.
I know someone, and you know someone, but I'm not going to say who it was. And it's not me, by the way. Stole money from a church when they were younger, and I think it still eats at this person.
Yeah.
Yeah. Someone we both know.
Right.
It's not Gemma either.
Aye, and it's not Callum, because everyone's going to be sitting going, it's Callum.
It's no one that the listeners know.
Aye.
But, you know, crime of opportunity as well, and then by the time you've done it, it's like, oh man, shit, what have I done, you know? But not in Angus's case, he didn't seem to be bothered by it. He was caught. This was his first proper brush with the law. He was convicted of theft and sentenced to 1 year's probation. He's 13. He's released back into the care of his mother on the condition that he behaves himself, essentially. He doesn't behave himself, Michael. Around this time, his sexual antics are accelerating quite dramatically. In a consultant psychiatrist report carried out in 1961, it's noted that when he was 14 years of age, so either in late 59 or early 60, he and his partner in crime at the time both began having regular sexual contact with two girls in return for packets of senior service cigarettes. More worryingly, I think, it also recounts an incident around the same time where he, having learned that a certain local girl of 17 years who had had sex with an older friend of his, and whom therefore, I think in Angus's messed up mind, I guess he presumed that meant she was like quote unquote fair game, you know?
Yeah.
He learned that she was going to be home alone, and he skived off school to go to her home and, to quote the report, succeeded in having intercourse with her in her own home. Now, there's something about this incident that doesn't sit well at all. Maybe it's just the language used of like succeeded, you know, sex is something to be prized out of women by manipulation, force. The report doesn't mention the words rape or harassment explicitly. Not in so many words, but considering this is Angus's side of the story only, there's something at best really sleazy and inappropriate about how he goes about this. So he doorsteps a young woman he has no real previous connection to with the premeditated intention to get her to have sex with him one way or another. Doing it at a calculated place and time where he knows she'll be alone, very cunning and creepy. And we don't have the girl side of the story, and I would not be surprised if her version of events involved a lot more coercion than Sinclair's, especially given what we know of him.
I was going to say as well, I think we might have touched on this the last episode, that sort of brutal combination of psychopathy and manipulation and charm.
Yeah, they often come together.
Certainly when it comes to killers, you know, I think serial killers, because they're able to lull people into a false sense of security. And we talked about how Angus and his friend, you know, would persuade those two poor girls at the pub to leave with them. And absolutely, it sounds like maybe he did rape that woman, but I'm just saying that it makes me think of that again, about just how manipulative someone like that can be. Maybe he did go there with a certain plan of manipulation, if you know what I mean, rather than brute force.
Or he's just able to identify people who are vulnerable, so even if he didn't physically force her, that's the other thing. Like, I've got a feel for how to get her to do what I want, and that's scary as well. That's almost just, but 100%. Now, I've mentioned that there's never been much indication that Sinclair was like sexually or emotionally abused as a child. It's not completely unheard of for someone who goes on to be a serial killer or a rapist to have had an outwardly happy childhood with no apparent abuse or trauma. However, that's the exception rather than the rule. It's very much the exception.
It's awful to say this, but there's always that little, especially if it's a serial killer who has been so brutal, and I mean they all are, but you do think, okay, maybe in the face things seem fine.
Yeah.
But is there stuff that's went on that even the parents don't know about?
Well,
or maybe they just don't want to cough up to, you know?
So I had this feeling that, like you say, was there something there that never really was talked about, or felt like maybe there was something there?
Mm.
And in the psychiatrist report, which I found as part of a Freedom of Information request online, I think it perhaps offers a tiny half glimpse into something that hasn't otherwise been much explored in the literature surrounding Sinclair. It notes as one operative factor in Sinclair's psychology an adult neighbour who, sometime before all this, befriended Sinclair and 3 of his friends. This man, and I quote, initially tried to frighten them, but later got round to regaling them with stories of his sexual prowess. And this then progressed to the man handing out pornographic magazines to the boys. Now, the question here, of course, is not why a teenage boy would be interested in looking at pornography. There's 1 or 2 teenage boys in the world who I'm sure has looked at pornography at some point.
Yeah.
The question is, what exactly is this grown man doing inviting 11 or 12-year-old boys into his home, telling them dirty stories and handing out pornography to them? What's his motivation to do that? And what is Sinclair omitting from this story when he's telling the psychiatrist about it?
Yeah.
Because what's in that report reads to me like what would now be recognised as a classic grooming behaviour.
Yeah.
There's no profit motive or anything. He's not a newsagent selling them this stuff. He's given away his own property to these boys. What's he getting in return?
Yeah.
I can't think of another good reason for an adult man to be plying adolescent boys with porn. It's a red flag the size of Russia.
Oh, definitely.
I don't know, but I do think it's a hell of a coincidence that this neighbour's untoward conduct towards these boys, and Angus in particular, coincides with the boys' sudden rampage of sexual misconduct. Precocious sexual activity and the kind of predatory attitude towards sex that young Angus exhibited are common indications of a sexual abuse victim. I think what we know about this particular facet of Angus's childhood might just be a tip of the iceberg. Later in 1959, the same year as the theft of the offertory box from the church, Sinclair was charged with housebreaking at a property lived in by a classmate of his. He arranged for a friend to steal the classmate's house key during school hours, and then with another boy, he used the key to gain access to the property and stole the grand sum of 2 shillings 7 pence. He left and then returned with yet another friend, this time not stealing anything, seemingly just for the thrill of being somewhere he shouldn't be, violating someone else's private space. What's interesting here, and with most of his other childhood offences, you can already see he's developing an MO where he likes to draw other guys into his crimes. He's not a loner. He likes to work with accomplices. For some reason, despite the fact he's still on probation for stealing from the church, he was only admonished for this crime. In Scots law, admonition is where an offender being found guilty is not given jail time or a fine, but instead given a verbal warning and then set free, and then it's put on their criminal record and that's it. Why he got off with this relatively light punishment, given the fact he was still on probation for his last conviction? Was it the small amount of money taken? Did the targeted family intervene on his behalf? I don't know. Around this time, a friend of his who was working for Muirhead Moffat & Co., a long-standing antique furniture dealership in Glasgow, shared with Sinclair an anecdote about having to deliver a table to a doctor working in a local VD clinic. Sinclair had no idea what he was talking about. At the age of 15, having been engaging in sexual activity of various kinds for 2 or 3 years, Sinclair had never heard of an STD. From that moment onwards, Sinclair would develop a fear of venereal disease. Now, I think it's probably quite trite to suggest this is the only reason. Obviously, there was a lot more at play there, but according to his psychiatrist report, Sinclair indicated that this was the moment he began to focus his sexual interests on persons much younger than himself. That was the way he puts it. He was going after younger people because they were less likely to give him a disease. It's pretty disgusting, really. This next section is likely to be especially distressing, so if you don't wish to hear discussion of crimes against young children, you may wish to skip forward 10 minutes or so. I'm not going to go into graphic detail, but...
Can I skip 10 minutes forward, please?
Just close your ears. In January 1961, when Sinclair was just 15 years old, he appeared at Glasgow Sheriff Court charged with the crime of lewd and libidinous behaviour towards an 8-year-old girl. The details of the crime are not well documented in the public domain, We don't know the circumstances. We don't know anything about the victim other than she was a neighbour who lived on St. Peter Street, just a few doors down from Sinclair. Lewd and libidinous conduct is a crime in Scots law that applies to situations where the perpetrator does something that falls just short of an outright sexual assault. There may be no actual physical contact with the victim, but it would be something more substantial than, say, indecent exposure. I don't want to get into any unpleasant speculation about what exactly might have happened, but this was the moment where his criminal career progressed from crimes of dishonesty to sex crimes and crimes against the person. In what would become a trend with Sinclair, he denied the crime he was charged with, and he tried in a pretty sophisticated and calculated way to lie and bluff his way out of the consequences of his actions. But he was convicted. He spent a few weeks in a remand home, and then, quite startlingly, bearing in mind he's still on probation for housebreaking and theft, he's handed just a further 3 years probation and sent home to his family, a few doors down from his victim. It was just 6 months after this crime, on the 1st of July 1961, that Sinclair first escalated to taking the life of another human being. On that day, Sinclair was left home alone when his mother and sisters set off to visit his older brother, who by this time was grown up and living elsewhere in the city. Almost as soon as they were gone from the house, Sinclair goes out and accosts 7-year-old Catherine Rehill, who's playing in the street just outside the tenement in which he lives. He gives her some money and asks her to go to the local corner shop for him to buy him some chocolate and bring it to his house. Catherine was a kind, helpful kid, eager to help. She took the money, ran the errand, and returned to Sinclair's home. Precisely what happened next was a matter of dispute in the days and weeks that followed. We'll come back to that. A short time later, 20 minutes, half an hour, something like that, a neighbour who lived in the same close as the Sinclairs, lived in a flat off the same stairwell, for those who don't know what close is, returned home to find a wee girl's lifeless body lying slumped at the bottom of the back stairs. The body was positioned in such a way to suggest that the child had fallen and tumbled down the stone steps. The neighbour called out for help, and lo and behold, Angus Sinclair comes running out of his flat asking what's happened. Like butter wouldn't melt in his mouth. The neighbour says, "A little girl's fallen down the stairs, phone an ambulance." And at that moment, I can only assume Sinclair thinks he's a fucking criminal mastermind because, of course, I'm sure I don't need to spell this out, but the little bastard has deliberately positioned poor Catherine's body at the bottom of the stairs precisely in order to make what's happened look like some kind of tragic accident. But it doesn't take the authorities long to spot that something's very wrong with this version of events. Catherine Rehill's body did not just have severe head injuries, she showed signs of having been sexually assaulted and injuries around her neck consistent with strangulation. And when they find out from neighbours that the boy who lived upstairs and was second or third on the scene, that teenage boy is a convicted sex offender, grave suspicions form over Angus Sinclair's head. The crime exhibits a strange mix of callous foresight and messy carelessness. In some ways, it's chilling the amount of apparent planning that went into the whole ruse of initially sending the girl to the shop for him in order to get her alone in his flat when she came back without directly luring her in. You know, by sending her away to make her come back rather than just telling her to come in. She wouldn't have done that, but she would have come back with the thing she bought for him, you know. His apparent attempt to maximise the use of his time alone while his mother and sisters are away in order to give him plenty of time to find a victim and carry out whatever he had planned. His posing of the body at the bottom of the stairs to fake an accident, something that actually worked on the first witnesses. And yet, did he not think, given the girl has been left in his stairwell, given his previous crimes which set all the neighbourhood tongues wagging and turned him into something of a local pariah, does he not think heavy suspicion is going to fall on him just for that? Does he not think they'll notice that he strangled her? When police ask him for the underwear he'd been wearing at the time of the attack so they can be forensically examined, he tries to bluff them by quite obviously giving them a different pair. It's like a weird mix of sinister calculation and childlike stupidity. It's quite disturbing in a way.
Yeah.
Because you can see the childlike stupidity in the actions, and yet that childlike stupidity is wrapped around this most horrific of crimes. Sinclair is arrested the following day and questioned. He swears up and down that he had nothing to do with Rehill's death. He denies it, quite convincingly at first. But later that night, his older brother is allowed to visit him in custody. The relationship between Angus and his brother, indeed the relationship with his whole family, appears to have been pretty good up to this point. His brother asks him straight out, "Did you do this?" Angus breaks down, admits his involvement. His brother tells him to come clean to the detectives.
His brother must have had a suspicion of what he was capable of.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, they know what he's been convicted of already.
Yeah.
I don't think they know what to do with him because they seem like a nice family. I literally just don't think they knew what to do about it. He makes a confession that on Catherine's return with the chocolate he'd sent her for, he'd invited her into his home with the intention of, and I quote Sinclair directly here, attempting to have sexual intercourse with her. Or rape, I think we would more reasonably call it. But that the girl fought back, and in trying to get away, she fell and hit her head against the wardrobe, causing a severe head injury. I quote here from the report of Kay Gardner, his probation officer. From this point, Sinclair states he remembers little else until he was on the stair landing outside the house, having left her body there. He returned to the house and decided to visit his brother, feeling he had to get away somewhere. As he left home, he discovered that neighbours had found the child, and it was apparent they thought there had been an accident. He offered to telephone for an ambulance, he made the call, and then went visiting in company with a friend. Again, we see here Sinclair showing signs of calculation. He's admitting to some terrible things, but not everything. He's admitting to what he knows they know, while leaving himself enough wiggle room to try and deny the intent to murder, in the hopes that he can get like a lesser sentence or whatever. He doesn't talk about strangling her, which is something we know happened. He claims to have had this almost like a blackout period, which is a particularly well-worn trope in the confessions of killers who want to confess to a certain extent, while still withholding some key details that they don't want to talk about. It also serves to maybe plant the seed for maybe an insanity defence or a diminished responsibility defence. If he can characterise the crime as some sort of episode, like he was in the grip of some flash of madness or something.
I think also a lot of psychopaths, I think sometimes they have a little bit of a strange inverted hero complex. They want to be seen in a certain way as special, and I think sometimes when people lie and say I blacked out and I don't remember anything, it's a way of trying to get the people that they're telling that to not see them in the worst light.
Yeah, maybe even elicit a degree of sympathy.
Yeah.
Something's wrong with him, something's happened.
Yeah.
Yeah. The problem is the facts just don't align with his way of characterising the events. In the window of time that Sinclair was known to have been in the flat with Catherine Rehill, in the midst of murdering the girl, a friend of Sinclair's knocked on the door. Sinclair took a break from strangling young Catherine to answer the door, and he stood there chatting for several minutes while his victim lay unconscious in the next room. Sinclair seemed completely normal to the other boy, completely composed, as he told this witness he wasn't able to come out right now, but he'd meet him at the bus stop later on. That witness left the property with not the slightest inkling or notion that anything was amiss with Sinclair. He saw no sign of distress or upset. He was not dishevelled or confused or frightened. He wasn't having an episode of any kind. He was cool as a cucumber. Sinclair then, having seen off the visitor, closed the door and calmly returned to the job of murder. Poor wee Catherine, at the time of her killing, had been staying with an aunt on St. Peter's Street. It's unclear from the records I've seen whether that was in the context of a visit or if this was a more permanent arrangement, but in with Sinclair's prison records for this crime, which again you can find publicly as part of a Freedom of Information release, there's a newspaper story that was apparently clipped by a governor at one of the prisons he was later held at. A very poignant story from the Evening News on the 3rd of July 1961, documenting the arrival in Glasgow of Catherine's parents, who had been living in London, having heard the news that their daughter has been murdered. It's a very simple, factual description of their arrival, but it's just heartbreaking. Catherine's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Patrick Rehill, learned of their daughter's death in London yesterday. They were traced and told of the tragedy by London police and travelled on the overnight train to Glasgow. They arrived here shortly before 10 a.m. Mrs. Veronica Rehill, pale-faced after a sleepless night, stepped from the train and walked a few yards ahead of her 34-year-old husband Patrick. As photographers' flashbulbs exploded all around them, the couple were quickly escorted to a waiting taxi. This is accompanied by a black and white photograph of Veronica Rehill being led out of the train station by a friend. Caught in the flashbulb's glare, she's just staring ahead, almost trance-like. What she's going through in that moment, it's hard to even imagine. According to an interview with Catherine Rehill's cousin, Anne Summers, in an interview with STV in March 2020, the family was just shattered by Catherine's murder, and Veronica Rehill especially was grief-stricken thereafter until her early death in the 1980s, aged only in her 50s. So, Angus Sinclair went to trial for the killing of Catherine Rehill. The Crown Office decided not to charge Sinclair with the crime of murder, because they did not believe they would be able to prove premeditation in the actual killing. To say that that's surprising to me is putting it mildly.
It's nuts.
I'm not part of the legal profession, right? It would be Dunning-Kruger of me to expect the outcomes of these things to always follow my gut reactions, but it does seem to me there were a lot of signs of premeditation there, and his moves to deflect those were quite transparent attempts by Sinclair at manipulating the story. It's staggering to me that they wouldn't at least attempt to get a murder conviction. It seems to me so manifestly a murder. Instead, Sinclair is charged with culpable homicide, manslaughter essentially, and he's sentenced to 10 years. I get that he's still more or less a child, and that does seem likely to have played a part in the lenience of that sentence. Generally speaking, I don't think we should be too quick to criminalise kids, generally speaking. But knowing what we know now, not just about Angus Sinclair in particular, but about violent sex crimes in general, 10 years and he's out in his 20s?
Yeah.
That's wild. Like, this doesn't seem like the pattern of offending where they're just going to grow out of it. It's not like thieving or fighting or being in a gang, where a bit of time, a lot of support, maybe a stable relationship, they meet a girlfriend or something, they can kind of grow out of that. This is different. That logic doesn't apply here. In fact, the consultant psychiatrist from the Royal Infirmary who interviewed him before the trial gave some stark and direful warnings that are all the more chilling today, looking back. As a result of my examination, I am of the opinion that this prisoner is in urgent need of constant care, control and supervision. I do not think that any form of psychotherapy is likely to benefit his condition, and he will constitute a danger to the lieges from now onwards. He is obsessed by sex and is to be expected that given the minimum of opportunity he will repeat these offences, irrespective of what promises he may give to the contrary. I regard him as a very dangerous sexual case and would urge the need for stringent supervision in his case. Even the judge himself, Lord Mackintosh, called Sinclair callous, cunning and wicked as he handed down the 10-year sentence for culpable homicide. And I definitely struggle to see how compatible callous, cunning and wicked are with mere manslaughter.
Yeah.
So he's sent to jail. Normally in the 1960s, a convict of his age, he's only 16 at this point, would have been sent to a Borstal institution, an infamous type of special detention centre for young offenders that existed up until the early 80s. However, there was a concern that putting a long sentence killer and sex offender into a Borstal with like football hooligans and thieves on short sentences would be disruptive. An internal memo notes, detention in a Borstal institution seems inappropriate. He would feel strongly the difference between the length of his sentence and the periods for which the other inmates are detained. They might victimise him because of his sexual aberrations, or conversely, he might exercise a harmful influence on others. So instead, he's sent for the first 3 years of his sentence to the adult prison in Aberdeen. Former Detective Chief Constable and author of The World's End, The Final Verdict, Tom Wood, believes that this spell in Aberdeen prison, in a wing populated almost exclusively by adult, violent and sexual offenders, with limited support and supervision for the extremely disturbed 16-year-old boy dropped in the middle of them, was the final formative process in creating the monster that was the adult Angus Sinclair. He was in there with some very hardened, perverted individuals, and his prison records show that he fitted in with these guys pretty well. He made a lot of friends, he was well liked by the other inmates, and by most of the guards, it should be said. And I get it, in prison you have to make the best of it. I'm sure it makes life a lot easier if you're well liked and have friends. You might have to get along with people you wouldn't necessarily get along with on the outside. But there's also the fact that many of these men share with Sinclair certain interests with regards to young girls, with regards to violence, with regards to putting their own urges before the well-being and rights of others, with regards to maybe their views of women. You have to wonder, what did he learn in there? What experiences, what fantasies, what stories did these older, more experienced offenders share with the young Angus Sinclair? And did the experience of being surrounded by these men and these attitudes help to crystallise and normalise his own dark predilections? A memo dated the 22nd of July 1964 notes that redacted and others have come to the conclusion that the associations Sinclair has established with other prisoners, notably name redacted, are undesirable. So it bears mentioning here also that at Aberdeen Prison, inmates were put to work making and maintaining trawler nets for the fishing boats. And this is where Sinclair learned to tie the advanced reef knots he later used to bind the victims in the World's End.
Terrifying, isn't it?
Awful.
That's just like a literal institutionalization.
Yeah.
The thing is, you're not going to blame it on that. He's obviously already a twisted individual. But that's the thing, someone like that, he's going to use...
He's learning tools and techniques that he's going to use later on.
He's going to make the most of every situation in the worst possible way.
Yeah, 100%. And we've not heard the last of those knots. After 3 years at Aberdeen, Sinclair was moved to HMP Edinburgh, also known as Saughton Prison, which at that time ran a pioneering programme called Training for Freedom, designed to teach long-term prisoners a trade and develop relationships between prisoners due for release and potential employers. In many ways, a very admirable, forward-thinking, progressive thing for the time. From reading the documents relating to Sinclair's imprisonment though, it's apparent that the authorities back then took a rather old-fashioned, one-size-fits-all sort of approach to this. There seems to have been a sense that, well, idle hands do the devil's work. We just need to make sure they have a job and some responsibilities and a wage packet every month, and they'll put their life of crime behind them. And in fact, yeah, that's probably true for most offenders. I absolutely 100% think that that's something we should be doing. But where it falls down is this idea that all criminals are like the fruit of the same tree. Someone who turns to stealing cars and robbery and gang crime because he doesn't feel like he's got a stake in society or anything to lose, I think would definitely benefit from that kind of program. Maybe recovering addicts, thieves and so forth. Yeah, definitely. But a serial killer or a child abuser or a rapist, these are not generally the kind of crimes people commit simply because they don't have enough routine in their lives. They're not crimes of necessity. They're not crimes of boredom or lack of opportunity. If you're one of those people, a 9-to-5 job is not going to be all it takes to drive those dark urges out of your head. Certainly not reliably enough to warrant early release from jail. And I should say, I think that that's something the criminal justice system is aware of now, but in the mid-60s, seemingly not so much. Sinclair learns painting and decorating. He gets his City and Guilds awards, and he gets a job with a company in Edinburgh that does painting and decorating. The Secretary of State for Scotland, I believe at that time, Willie Ross, Labour MP for Kilmarnock, signed off on Sinclair's early release in 1968. So Sinclair is popular and reliable at work. His employers like him. He makes friends on the job. He impresses his parole officers. He gives every indication of being a reformed character to the outside world. Although it should be noted that prison memos suggest that his jailers saw through this. They'd known him for long enough, and that he would play the game very well while still showing a complete lack of remorse for the things he'd done before. He has a number of relationships in this time. None of those relationships reported anything particularly untoward or abusive, but all recounted being taken for rides in a van owned by Sinclair and touring various quiet, remote areas, including the very same areas of East Lothian where Christine and Helen's bodies would later be dumped.
Wow. You wonder if he was thinking about doing it to someone he was in a relationship with.
As we'll see as we go on, all the places he dumped bodies were places he had some connection to, because they were always like little quiet, out of the way places that you had to know. You had to know these places to dump a body there, you know? So maybe he is partly thinking like, this is somewhere I could dump someone. But the significance of that for the investigations is simply to show that he knew of these obscure places where people would be dumped and sometimes not be found for days and days and days afterwards. In 1970, 25-year-old Sinclair entered into a more serious relationship with a 20-year-old student nurse called Sadie Hamilton, who usually went by the name Sarah. On May the 25th of the same year, early in the morning, as first light was creeping across the sky, Christopher Holmes, a 25-year-old computer programmer, was walking his dog on the edge of Holyrood Park, close to the end of the Royal Mile, when he noticed the naked corpse of a young woman slumped on some land that had been cleared for construction. The previous night, Helen Kane, 25 years old, mother of 4, had been out for drinks on Duke Street in Leith, the sort of harbour area of the city, a couple of miles from the city centre, with her husband Joe and a group of friends. It's unclear whether there'd been a falling out or whether she'd simply left the group before the others were ready to go home, but about 11:25 p.m, she broke off and headed by herself to get a cab. Shortly afterwards, witnesses saw someone closely matching her description being helped into a taxi by an unknown male. The taxi then headed off towards the central area of the city. A little later, a couple matching the description were seen together in the shadows of Holyrood Park. Holyrood Park is a strange, barren wilderness just plopped down in the middle of the city of Edinburgh. I'm sure you know it, Michael, but it's a similar size to Central Park in New York. But park evokes like a landscape, well-kept, civilized sort of place.
Trees and...
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Like flowers and things. Holyrood Park is a really wild place. Arthur's Seat, a small mountain, basically hangs over it. There are rocky cliffs, there are wee lochs. You can basically step off a busy city street right into unlit heather and gorse and mountainous, craggy terrain like the Highlands or something. The area of Holyrood Park they were seen at is closely adjacent to the building site where Helen Kane's body was discovered the next morning, and less than half a mile from where Sinclair was now living in newly wedded bliss with his wife Sarah on Hill Place. Helen had been sexually assaulted and then bludgeoned to death with a stone slab. Sinclair has never been conclusively tied to the murder of Helen Kane, and not everyone involved in the investigation is of the belief that this was his handiwork. Detective Chief Constable Tom Wood, author of The World's End, The Final Verdict, among them, is not convinced. But a number of detectives who worked this case, including former Detective Superintendent Alan Jones, strongly suspect that this was Sinclair's second murder, and probably his first major adult crime following his spell in prison for the killing of Catherine Rehill. As it happens, with Sinclair being a known murderer and sex offender living nearby, he was interviewed by police at the time for this crime. However, he was excluded from the investigation when a family member gave him an alibi. Which family member gave that alibi does not seem to have been recorded in any surviving documentation, which is a shame because that question of who exactly in the family vouched for him could shine a completely different light on that alibi depending on who it was, as we'll see. Sarah had little idea of Angus's double life. She was only vaguely aware of his previous crime. Their early relationship seemed pretty normal, relatively happy, other than the possibility of involvement in the Helen Kane murder, which seemed to coincide closely with the marriage, with them actually getting married. There are few indications that he was active as a serial killer during the first few years of his marriage. You see that sometimes, like a killer stops when they get married or have a kid or something like that, but sometimes it's almost like they go out for one last hurrah around about the time they get married or just after the birth of a child, and then they stop for a long time. It's something that's seen also in Joseph James D'Angelo, the original Night Stalker, but it's interesting to potentially see that here as well. Sarah's family had a bit of a Marmite relationship with Sinclair. The mother and father were disapproving at first. They didn't attend the registrar on the day of their daughter's marriage. That's how much they didn't trust him. But Angus was great at putting on a presentable face and bringing people around to him, and her parents warmed to him over time. Things were a bit rockier with Sarah's 9 brothers and sisters. Thomas, her older brother, would call him a nonce. He didn't know the details of what he'd done before, but he was 100% correct. And he tried to get his family to break off contact with him. Nonce is a British prison slang for like a sex offender, basically.
Is it more specifically a paedophile?
I'm not sure if you were a rapist. You might be called a nonce. I'm not sure. Possibly. I wasn't sure, so I thought I'd keep it broad. I think you're probably right about that.
Patreon special episode, everyone.
What's a nonce?
Martin and Mike discuss what's a nonce.
A younger brother who isn't named in any of the books or documentation I've seen, on the other hand, would grow very close to Sinclair and would spend a lot of time with him, and actually ended up working alongside Sinclair at the painting and decorating company. And as time went on, Sinclair would start to involve him more and more in criminal activities. Not sexual criminal activities, as far as I can tell, but he definitely indoctrinated the boy somewhat into his own unsavoury world. He always liked to have a pal when he was committing crimes, it seems. The Hamilton family had its issues. I mean, most families do, one way or another. Some folk in the family were hard-working, law-abiding people, but according to Tom Wood, there does seem to have been a predisposition to alcoholism that ran in the family, and there were several of the family, Stephen among them, unfortunately, who struggled quite profoundly with their relationship to alcohol and mental health. And they consequently led lives that were, at times, quite chaotic and even criminal in nature. And I think Angus Sinclair was able to read that. And this comes back to what I was talking about earlier. He was able to spot how he could use and manipulate people and target the weak points, as it were, and inveigle one or two of them into his bullshit, even while other members of the family saw right through him and did everything they could to avoid him. But one member of the Hamilton clan that didn't outwardly seem to have any particular relationship with Sinclair one way or the other, not in front of the other family members anyway, was Gordon Hamilton. According to surviving members of the family interviewed in the 2000s and 2010s, Gordon and Angus Sinclair only ever seemed to be on nodding terms. In actual fact, unbeknownst to the family, Gordon and Angus had developed a private friendship that ran way deeper than his involvement with Stephen, because in Gordon Hamilton, his own brother-in-law, Sinclair found not just someone who was up for a bit of robbery or violence, but someone who shared certain dark secret interests. So again, you think back on that alibi for the Helen Kane murder, and with hindsight you wonder, what if it was Gordon or Stephen who gave him that alibi?
Yeah.
Sinclair's return to habitual offending, following the period of relative stability during the honeymoon years of his relationship with Sarah, seemed to coincide with the slow deterioration of that relationship. Whether the desire to reoffend came about as like a reaction to the relationship going sour, or whether the relationship started falling apart because the dark side of Sinclair was resurfacing, I don't think we can really say. It's a chicken and egg situation, isn't it? What is known is the breakdown of their marriage began, as in so many relationships, with just simple infidelities. Starting a couple of years into the marriage, not long after actually they had their son, he had at least 6 affairs within the space of just a couple of years. It's interesting, you can almost compare the course of his escalation back towards violent crime with the escalation of his crimes in adolescence. You have the same initial rise in sort of like hypersexuality, his affairs in adulthood, his precocious activity with many different partners as a young teen. Then you have like a slow growth of petty crime escalating towards more and more serious offences, committed in many cases with a male co-conspirator. In the 2000s, after the identification of Sinclair and in the process of building that first failed trial for the World's End murders, Tom Hall and other detectives tracked Stephen Hamilton down to a small bedsit in London. He was in his 50s at that point. This is the younger brother, not Gordon Hamilton, the one that killed with him. This is the younger brother. In his 50s at this point, he's in very poor health and he's living alone in what seems to have been a fairly impoverished existence. Like his brother Gordon, his life after his association with Sinclair had been chaotic and plagued with drink. He was, as Tom Hall put it, in quite a sorry state by the time they got to him. He was, however, incredibly helpful to the investigators, even to the point of incriminating himself. He freely spoke of the criminal world that Angus Sinclair had introduced him to, and the types of crimes that the pair committed together. Initially break-ins and till snatching thefts, but growing in violence to include, to give just one example, a shop robbery where a young employee was beaten by Sinclair with a hammer for getting in his way, and finally culminating in a horrendously violent home invasion that police were able to link back to an unsolved historic case. In April 1976, a woman that Hall refers to as Elizabeth Black, not a real name, left her tenement flat on Bridgeburn Drive in Moodiesburn in Lanarkshire to go to work, while her 7-year-old daughter and her husband John remain home. John has been working a night shift, so he's in bed. The daughter is sitting in the living room watching television. It's rent day. This was an era before everyone paid their rent with a direct debit, so that still meant an employee of the landlord literally coming to your door asking for cash. Elizabeth knew her husband would sleep late, so she entrusted the money to the wee girl, with strict instructions that she answer the door when the rent man called, hand over the money, and sign the ledger. Simple. At 10 a.m, there's a knock at the door. The girl picks up the money, walks to the door, and opens it. It's not the rent collector. Instead, she finds herself face to face with two men wearing stockings pulled over the heads, one carrying a knife and one brandishing a hammer. The taller of the two men, the knife wielder, and likely Stephen Hamilton, puts the blade to her throat and dragged her towards the living room. Her screams wake her father, who sits up in bed, just in time to see the hammer man, the shorter and likely Sinclair himself, burst through his bedroom door and threaten to smash his head in. He too is dragged into the living room, where the father and the daughter are bound and gagged with adhesive tape. Mercifully, because knowing Sinclair with the presence of the little girl, I'm sure this could have gone another way, the incapacitated victims are then left alone on the floor, while the intruders wait by the front door for the arrival of the rent collector. When the rent man arrived, the home invaders dragged him into the kitchen, tied him to a chair, while the shorter man, Sinclair, proceeded to viciously batter him around the head with a hammer, demanding the key to the cash safe he kept in the car. They got what they came for, and they left to steal the rent money stored in the collector's vehicle. John and his daughter must have thought they'd seen the last of them when suddenly the knife wielder reappeared, only now, instead of a knife, he was carrying a wad of cash which he threw at the terrified father and daughter, saying, "This is for your troubles, sorry about the inconvenience," before exiting again, never to return.
That's bizarre.
But note that it would have been Stephen Hamilton that came back almost in some way to slightly mitigate what happened with the money. Not that it really makes any difference, but Angus is gone. He doesn't give a shit about those people, When John Black finally worked his way free of the tape, he entered the kitchen and found it completely splattered with blood, and the rent collector, with horrific head injuries, still strapped to the chair. Fortunately, it appears that the rent collector survived this attack. This never progressed to a murder investigation, so I can only presume he by some miracle survived, but he was damn lucky, I think. Elizabeth and John Black were actually traced as part of that 2000s investigation. I think they'd pretty much given up on it ever being solved, but they were able to corroborate details of Stephen Hamilton's account. Imagine that you have this scary experience, right? Years pass, you've kind of half forgotten about it, you put it behind you. 3 decades later, police tell you that the man that broke into your house and threatened you and your daughter was probably Scotland's most prolific serial killer of modern times. It's mad. Another interesting tidbit from Stephen Hamilton's account is that he and Sinclair had actually been on a painting and decorating job nearby at the time of this attack. In the course of working in the neighbourhood, Sinclair had noted that A, the rent collector came around like clockwork at a certain time on a certain day each week, and B, when John Black worked the night shift, he slept in later the next day, leaving his daughter to answer the door. They carried out this crime while on a tea break from their painting job. Afterwards, Stephen Hamilton, obviously, he's full of adrenaline and he's all a bit discombobulated, as most of us probably would be being involved in a violent crime like that on either side of it, you know. Especially, probably not even known at this stage whether the rent collector he's just seen battered around the head by his partner in crime has been killed or not. A guy's head's been bashed in with a hammer. But
Yeah.
Angus Sinclair picked up his paint roller with a steady hand and went back to work. Calmly, coolly. As if raiding a family home, beating a man almost to death, was no different than making a sandwich. True psychopath. I also think that this crime, which is probably the peak of an escalation from more minor offences, marked the full return of the psychopathic murderer after that relative stability of the family man Sinclair of his early marriage. In 1977 into 78, beginning around a year after the Moodiesburn home invasion, Sinclair would undertake a half-year-long spree of murder in which, according to the most reliable estimates, he averaged at least one victim a month. And his partner in crime for at least some of those murders would be the other brother of Sarah Hamilton that we mentioned, Gordon Hamilton. In a family already riven by addiction and petty crime, Gordon Hamilton somehow still managed to be the black sheep. Most of his siblings found him overbearing and weirdly egotistical. He of course shared with some of the other family members the alcohol problems and certain other issues, but he didn't particularly fit in otherwise. And latterly, after he married and after the spree of murders, he sort of tapered off contact with them. But at this stage in 1978, he's still somewhat involved in the family and with Angus Sinclair. Although his relationship with Sinclair was never noted by the others who knew him as being particularly close, Sarah Hamilton did note that one thing they apparently shared was a love of fishing. And that for a couple of years in the late 70s, Michael, despite not seeming particularly close friends the rest of the time, this odd pair would, every few weeks, take off in Sinclair's Toyota Hiace van for weekend-long fishing trips. Only, looking back, it was strange because they never seemed to bring home any fish. On Friday the 11th of June 1977, 37-year-old Frances Barker disappeared following a night out with family in Glasgow. I'm sure you can see something of a pattern here already. She'd had a large amount to drink that night and had to be helped into a taxi by her sister and niece. The cabbie drove her back to her home just off Maryhill Road in the northwest of the city, not terribly far from where Angus grew up, incidentally, and on the very same street his mother was living on at the time, at whose address Sinclair had just registered his newly acquired Toyota Hiace. And Frances was last seen as she got out of the car and made her way towards her front door on foot. However, as it turns out, in the confusion of pub closing time, Frances had picked up the wrong coat on her way out. The keys in the pocket of this one were not the keys to her own front door, and she lived alone. She would have been locked out of the house after midnight on a Friday night. The following Monday, when she didn't show up to work and didn't answer any calls, several of her co-workers contacted her brother, and together they all made their way to her flat. When they got no answer at the door, her brother forced entry and found the flat tidy, with no signs of a struggle, no signs of Frances. Of course, as we now know, she hadn't been in there since early on Friday. Over a fortnight later, a rotting corpse was discovered by a young farm worker in a copse of trees outside Glen Boig, a village a few miles east of the city. It was Frances. Like the World's End victims, she'd had her arms and legs tied with pieces of her own clothing, and she'd been gagged with her own underwear. Like Catherine Rehill, she'd been strangled with a makeshift garrote, and like both Helen Kane and the rent collector, she'd also been severely bludgeoned around the head. Glen Boig, incidentally, was somewhere Sinclair would go on the few occasions he actually did go fishing, so he was quite familiar with it. I mean, I wouldn't know Glen Boig. It's just outside the city where I live. I've never even heard of it. He knew it because he went fishing there. Another man, another sex offender by the name of Thomas Ross Young, was arrested, charged, and ultimately convicted of this crime. Young would die in prison in 2014, still adamantly protesting his innocence and pointing to Sinclair as the culprit. In the years after his death, however, several investigators, including Detective Superintendent Eddie McCusker, who led a cold case review into Francis's killing, without going into great amounts of detail, have stated that there is now a compelling case to suggest that Sinclair was involved. Whether that's a case of Sinclair alone, or whether that's a case of Sinclair with Gordon Hamilton, or even Sinclair with Thomas Young, or all three of them, the tendency for Sinclair to commit murders in conspiracy with other men without giving himself away to normal people in a population where I think the vast majority would want to smash his face in if they knew what he was planning, it has some quite disturbing implications, particularly in relation to certain things that we've still to get to. You read about child abuse rings and things like that, where, these creeps group together over a shared fucked up interest. Given the strangely social nature of Sinclair's offending, is it possible he was at the centre of some kind of twisted murder ring? We'll kind of come back to that though. But there's just so much about that crime that appears to link in Angus Sinclair. There's so many things that just scream out Angus Sinclair's handiwork. On top of all that, it's not exactly common for police themselves to be announcing to the world evidence about the involvement of someone else in a case that's nominally been fully solved and convicted and closed. It doesn't make them look good. There's little incentive for them to be doing that unless what they have is really quite convincing. Less than 2 months later, on the 5th of August in the same year, 20-year-old Anna Kenny and her best friend Wilma Sutherland went on a night out to the Hurdy-Gurdy bar in Townhead, just to the east of the city centre, not far from the Cathedral District and the Glasgow Necropolis. Anna and Wilma were a seemingly inseparable pair. They were bubbly, outgoing types. They'd previously worked together at Butlins Holiday Park at Filey in Yorkshire, which to our British listeners probably gives some flavour of their sort of happy-go-lucky nature. By August 1977 though, the twosome had just started new jobs, again working together at Port Dundas Distillery. They were out to celebrate their first paycheck together. They're having fun, they're drinking hard, they're chatting to various friends who are coming and going, and they fall into the company of two men. Immediately this is ringing a bell, right? The events so far are strikingly similar to the circumstances of the World's End murders, which would occur just a couple of months after this. But listen close, because there's a slight subversion of expectations coming. Wally and Joe, as they're referred to in World's End, the final verdict, I don't think that's the real names, are not Angus Sinclair and Gordon Hamilton. They are not the perpetrators of the crime I'm about to describe, just to be very clear. They would later be identified and completely cleared of any wrongdoing. The fact that the scene in that pub with the four of them is almost a carbon copy of the scenario later at the World's End seems to be nothing but a red herring, and the involvement of these two men will be a red herring to police as well, as we'll see. At the end of the night, they all leave the pub together, and Wilma and Joe and Wally and Anna had sort of broken off into pairs. Wilma and Joe stopped to kiss in a doorway and fell behind Wally and Anna. Wilma clearly saw Anna and Joe walking away together. They too are in a, shall we say, drunkenly affectionate state. They kiss each other a couple of times, but Wally would claim it didn't really go any further than that. Ultimately, Anna seemed to want to get herself a taxi home, so they say their goodbyes, and the last he sees of her is, as he's walking off, her sticking her arm out trying to hail a taxi. He was the last known person to report seeing Anna alive. There were no witnesses of any kind to abduction. No one saw her getting in a taxi or any other kind of vehicle. No one saw any struggle or heard any screams. On that busy street in central Glasgow, it just seems like no one really saw her again. It's like she literally just melted into thin air. The next day, noting that it was strange she hadn't heard from her friend after their night of drinking and romantic intrigue, Wilma goes to Anna's house, but she's nowhere to be found. She starts to worry. She contacts Anna's parents, and later that day, Anna's reported as a missing person. In what I'm sure comes as no surprise, Wally was initially suspected of having something to do with Anna's disappearance, and at first, he didn't really do much to allay suspicion or to endear himself to the police. When interviewed, he completely denied having been with Anna in those last few minutes, despite having been seen with her by Joe and Wilma and other witnesses coming across very much like a guilty man, right? Eventually, Wally would admit to being with Anna. It turns out Wally had a wife and newborn child at home, and that's why he'd lied.
Yeah.
Luckily for him, he bumped into two groups of friends and acquaintances on the walk home and chatted with them, and that was then able to provide an alibi that he had been walking home within a very short time of when he left, and so he was excluded from the investigation. Had that not happened, I think his life thereafter could have been very, very different. Could have had a lot more iron bars and porridge in it, if you know what I mean. Anna's remains weren't discovered until 2 years later. In April 1979, her skeleton was excavated from a shallow grave on the Kintyre Peninsula at Skipness, a 115-mile drive from Glasgow. Once again, the victim had been bound using items of her own clothing. No forensic evidence was found due to the length of time that had elapsed and the advanced decay of Anna's body, but both Strathclyde Police and the Behavioural Sciences Unit at Quantico, Virginia, who were later involved in consultation with Scottish Police over Angus Sinclair's crimes, have stated that they believe with some certainty the same man is involved in this crime, the World's End murders, and several others around this time. But before we move on, there's something else I need to tell you about the case of Anna Kenny, Michael. And this, to me, is probably the most mind-blowing single detail I've covered in any episode of Talking Till Dawn. By the time Anna Kenny's body is discovered in Argyll 2 years after the fact, her best friend, who once again was there with her that night and was the second last known person to see Anna before her disappearance, Wilma, right? She was married by this time. She met her husband in the Hurdy-Gurdy, the very same pub where she'd been with Anna before her disappearance. She met him at Christmas time in 1977, so just a handful of months, 4 months later. She met this guy, they got talking, they started dating, and a little under a year later, in October 1978, they married. The man she married was Gordon Hamilton, Angus Sinclair's brother-in-law, whom DNA would much later prove was involved with Angus Sinclair in at least the World's End murders, if not several more killings. Just mind-blowing. What does it mean? Is it sheer coincidence? Or is it that she was one of the main faces of the investigation? Like, she was up there making public appeals for information. Had he noticed her as someone associated with a murder he was involved in? And becoming involved with her was like some kind of sick living trophy? You know, like how some serial killers will take trinkets from the victims. Like, he's taken a wife.
Yeah. Some of them also return to the scenes.
Well, exactly, yeah.
They sort of get off on it.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Or...
it's a wild coincidence.
It's wild if it is a coincidence, but alternatively, maybe he initially got in with her just to keep an eye on how the investigation was going. Or something else. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to read it.
It can't be a coincidence.
It can't. He must have realised, even if it was initially a coincidence, he must then have realised who she was.
That's wild.
Because, and we'll get to this actually, but the most unbelievable thing of all, imagine having your best friend kidnapped and murdered, right? Imagine dedicating a large part of your life to finding out the truth, almost being consumed by that unanswered question, and having no idea that the person you've married since the crime probably has the answer to that in his head the whole time you're married to him, and he never tells you.
Yeah.
Poor Wilma, man. I wish I had more to tell you about Gordon Hamilton other than what we've already said, because after Angus Sinclair, he is sort of the secondary antagonist in all this, but the man was a bit of an enigma, even to his own family. And of course, he conveniently died before any investigation could connect him to the murders. He doesn't seem to have been popular. He was overbearing and unlikable, and latterly disappeared down the hole of alcoholism. Wilma said he was violent with her, he had affairs, and he was already drinking unhealthily by the time they were married, and it just got worse and worse until they eventually separated. But she says he was with her when police came to give her the news that Anna had been found. The fucking guy visited Anna's parents with Wilma. Unbelievable.
That's unreal.
Yeah. Like, what was going on in his head in that moment? Was he nervous? Was he getting off on it?
It's almost like something out of a crime novel.
You'd think it was...
And if it happened, you wouldn't believe it. You'd be like, ah, it's too much.
Do you throw the book down if it happened? Fucking in the fire. In the fire, that's too far-fetched.
Straight in the bin. But it is, I mean, it's going to be cliched saying it, you know what I'm going to say, but, you know, people say truth's stranger than fiction. Yeah. And sometimes you do have these coincidences that are so... I'd love to do an episode on it, actually. I don't know if we've touched on it before, but talking about Carl Jung's synchronicity.
Oh, yeah.
Which, you know, he believed that most coincidences were coincidences, but he believed that the coincidences that held most meaning and seemed so outlandish were actually kind of causal events in some way, that meaning in people's lives had caused those events to happen.
Yeah.
And I know it sounds new agey, but Carl Jung was an amazing thinker. He might have been wrong about a lot of stuff, but when it comes to like strange, really strange coincidences like that was his idea. He believed that there was something else going on sometimes in these more peculiar ones. But like you say, this might not be a coincidence at all. It might be a sadistic, manipulative psychopath.
I suppose if you think about it, there could be a small coincidence at the start, like they happen to meet and he happens to realise who she is. Like that is a small coincidence. Not a massive coincidence, but you know, you bump into people and you go, I think I know who that is. And then that small coincidence becomes opportunism, maybe, I don't know. The other thing is, she always said that she was in like a really bad emotional place after her friend died. She was maybe quite vulnerable and he saw that.
Yeah.
That's the other sad side of it.
It's horrific. Absolutely horrific. I mean,
unbelievable.
It was horrific anyway, you know, but that's just...
Yeah, it piles a whole other layer on top of it.
Totally bizarre.
In the early hours of the 2nd of October 1977, the hard-working, loving mother of two, Hilda Macaulay, was also murdered. Once again, the crime bore all the hallmarks of Angus Sinclair and possibly Gordon Hamilton, and it too has been linked to the series by the Scottish Police and the FBI Behavioural Crimes Unit at Quantico. The 36-year-old divorcee, once again, had been out with friends, had broken off on her own, and was last seen leaving Glasgow's Plaza Ballroom and possibly accepting a lift home from a well-dressed man. Her life would be cut short, and her two young sons would be deprived of their mother's love and care for the rest of their lives, all to satisfy some creep's fleeting, grubby little sexual thrill. It's disgusting. As are every one of these cases, of course, but I think it always bears reminding ourselves, especially when there's so much media out there that I think borderline sometimes romanticizes serial killers. Yeah. They're not exciting outlaws. They're not like badass alpha anti-hero. You know, the impacts of their crimes are certainly dramatic, but the acts themselves and the impulses that drive them are dirty, weak, pathetic, stupid little selfish things, really, when you burrow right down to it.
Yeah.
One of the reasons that I don't often use words like evil or monster, though they certainly fit in Sinclair's case, is those words for me carry a suggestion of like power and awe that just doesn't capture how pathetic their dirty wee secret is, how risible and miserable and worthless I find them as individuals. Evil carries with it the idea of this sort of grandiose spiritual power. It ties in with things like things of supernatural and religious importance. A monster in literature and in metaphor is a force to be reckoned with.
Yeah.
These guys, rapists, child abusers, I think that's how they would like to be seen once they're caught, at least. You know, if I can't be liked, I can at least inspire fear and awe. Yeah. It massages their egos, but really they're just fucking wimps with a bunch of weird hang-ups, and they lack the empathy and the courage and the basic human dignity and fortitude to deny themselves their impulses, to put the rights of other complete human beings ahead of their own stupid, grotty wee sex fantasies. And that's really the most pathetic thing of all, I think. You know, if the deaths of these innocent people and the ripple effects of grief and loss on their families and loved ones weren't so awful, I think I would almost feel the urge to want to laugh and sneer at the kinds of losers who commit these crimes. They're not anti-heroes, they're cowards in the face of their own disgusting impulses, and that's pathetic. It really is pathetic.
Yeah, sometimes people treat them almost with like outlaw status. Mm-hmm. Like our good friend Elmer McCurdy, he was an outlaw.
Oh, he was a proper outlaw.
Never killed anybody as far as I remember.
But he had more outlaw in his little finger than Angus Sinclair has in his whole body. 100%.
Yeah. Have you seen Once Upon a Time in Hollywood?
I haven't seen it yet, no.
I won't ruin it, but I'll just say that the thing I loved most about it was that Tarantino made the Manson family and what they were trying to do pathetic.
Yeah.
In a way that, and Charles Manson's probably the most deified killer of all time.
Yeah.
And
yeah, I'm looking forward to checking that out.
And incidentally, just a little aside, because I've been reading Chaos, which is a book about the Manson killings, and it's really incredible. And I've got the Once Upon a Time in Hollywood book as well. But I'd love to do some podcasts on that, but obviously it's such a well-trodden case. But Charles Manson killed other people. All this stuff about he never killed anyone. No, he was never convicted of it, but
yeah,
there were other deaths. There were other murders. Your excellent point there about people who do these things, they're pathetic. That was something that I thought Tarantino did amazingly in that movie, and I would highly recommend it to anyone. It's one of the most enjoyable films I've watched in a long time.
Yeah, I look forward to checking it out. Hilda's body was found the next day by a man and his two sons picking berries and hunting rabbits near a lover's lane, a place that would later be cleared to form a section of the M8 motorway at Lang Bank. Hilda had been bound, gagged and strangled in the classic Sinclair fashion. Sinclair's sister lived just a short distance away from this spot. An ex-girlfriend said he had once taken her there in his van, and a criminal friend of Sinclair's who'd been involved in a number of thefts with him claimed Sinclair had once taken him to almost certainly the same obscure, out-of-the-way place to test fire a pistol he'd acquired for future robberies. Like all the disposal sites, it was clearly somewhere he was very familiar with. The World's End murders took place just 2 weeks later, which we covered in the last episode. Then, on either the night of the 3rd or the morning of the 4th of December of 1977, 23-year-old Agnes Cooney was also murdered, also in Glasgow, again in very similar circumstances. Agnes was a fun, kindly, caring young woman who worked as a house parent in a kids' care home in Bells Hill. That day, she and a friend had been viewing a rental flat in Maryhill with a possible view to moving in together. There's that Maryhill connection again.
See the Maryhill thing? Sorry, I can't remember. Did Angus Sinclair, was that where he grew up?
So he grew up just between Maryhill Road and Garscube Road, so not in Maryhill as such, but in that general region of the city. But then his mother moved to Maryhill, and he did things like he would register vehicles to her name and he would spend a lot of time at her place.
Sinclair was born in 1945. My dad was born in 1947. And he grew up in Maryhill.
What school did he go to?
I'm trying to think. I don't know if it was Postle Park.
Don't think he went to Postle Park School. I can't remember the name, but yeah.
But it's just also, I'm thinking, my dad's whole family were there.
Yeah.
So you just wonder.
Even if he didn't live in Maryhill, Maryhill was in his orbit as a child. He would have known it intimately. It would have been just up the road. So yeah, someone in your family probably at least knows someone who knows someone who knew him. There'll be a connection somewhere, 100%. Yeah. After viewing this flat in Maryhill, they then went to a gig that the friend's boyfriend's band was playing at the Claddagh Club in Westmoreland Street in Govan Hill, in a completely different area of the city. After the show, which finished up about 11 p.m, Agnes and her friend helped the band disassemble their setup and load the gear into their van, which was parked out of the rear door of the venue. While loading the van, band members noticed another van parked across the street, possibly a camper van, something like a Toyota Hiace. At some point, Agnes, who had been in and out of the back door carrying amps and other equipment, walked out of the club in a perfectly normal, happy, easygoing mood, not angry, not upset or drunk. She walked out that back door as if she was just popping back out to the van with one last thing, and she never came back. It was several minutes before Agnes's friend and the band members realised that she'd seemingly gone without saying goodbye. They walked out of the venue to look for her, thinking maybe she'd be standing at a bus stop or something. This wasn't an area of Glasgow she was familiar with. They'd been intending to offer her a lift home. But no, she'd gone into the night. The van across the street had also disappeared. It wasn't until the following day, when she failed to turn up to work, that anyone really began to suspect anything was wrong. And at 9 a.m, one day later, Sunday the 4th of December, a man driving a tractor on a farm road outside Caldercrooks in Lanarkshire, about 20 miles from where Agnes had last been seen, noticed a human body dumped at the edge of a field. She'd been bound and gagged with parts of her own clothing. Agnes showed most of the usual hallmarks of Angus Sinclair's previous work. This is another one that's been about as close to formally connected to Sinclair as you can get by both Scottish police and analysts at Quantico, without it actually being officially charged. But in addition to the usual calling cards, she'd also been tortured and stabbed 26 times. Furthermore, it had been about a day and a half since she went missing, and there were clear signs that she had not been dead for anything like that length of time. It's likely that Agnes had been taken and held somewhere for perhaps as long as 24 hours, or more maybe, somewhere like maybe a camper van, and held captive by quite possibly more than one person for some twisted, violent purposes. Does the addition of torture and a frenzied knife attack point to further escalation by Sinclair, if indeed it was him? Or does it point to Gordon Hamilton settling into his role in the killings, finding his own style of killing, adding his own features to the crimes? Because bear in mind, this murder and those of Hilda Macaulay, Anna Kenny, Francis Barker, and the World's End slayings all occurred at weekends. All of these victims were taken an hour either side of midnight on a Friday or Saturday night, every one of them, during the period in which Gordon Hamilton and Angus Sinclair were going off on these strange weekend fishing trips that never produced any fish. Fishing trips were what they told Sarah Hamilton they were going off on. Knowing what they were actually up to, it's hard not to imagine Angus and Gordon also referring to these murders among themselves as fishing trips in a sort of twisted euphemism. Is that how they saw these acts? I wonder, some kind of brutal sport? In the wake of Agnes Cooney's death, there was a fair amount of press coverage around the unusual van that had been seen hanging around the venue. And this publicity around the van, Michael, coincided with Angus Sinclair deciding to sell his Toyota Hiace. On the 19th of November 1978, a 17-year-old girl called Mary Gallagher, oldest in a family of 6, left her Keppoch home in the north of Glasgow about 6:30 in the evening to meet with friends and then head to the Fir Hill Club at the Partick Thistle football stadium.
Also in Maryhill.
Not quite in Maryhill, but up that way, yeah, almost.
Yeah, kind of. Their favourite song's Mary of Maryhill.
Yeah. In Glasgow in late November, 6:30 p.m. is full darkness. On her way, Mary's walking across some waste ground in Springburn. This is all still in the general region of the city where Sinclair grew up. And she's fallen into step with an 11-year-old boy, a local kid that she knew that she'd happened to bump into, and they were walking along together, chatting. From a distance, the pair of them probably looked about the same age because Mary Gallagher was a young woman of unusually small stature. As they reached a particular quiet, isolated section of the path, a strange man stepped out in front of the pair, staring intensely at them, a chilling, piercing stare. At the sight of this, the 11-year-old boy got spooked and, with the unself-conscious reflex of a child, he ran off. I think he was probably expecting Mary to do the same, but she's a bit older, she doesn't have that kind of flightiness, and I suspect that boy sadly spent the rest of his life unsure of whether to regret not sticking around or to be grateful that he escaped. Would Sinclair have done what he was about to do if the boy had stuck around? He's clearly on his own in this instance, he's not with Gordon Hamilton, or would the boy just have become yet another victim? But Mary, she didn't run away. That was the last time anyone but her killer saw her alive. She was found later in some bushes nearby. She'd been strangled, sexually assaulted, and had the leg of her jeans wrapped around her neck as a strangling device, and her throat was cut. This is one of the handful of murders that Sinclair was actually fully charged, tried, and convicted for. But that conviction would not happen for another 23 years. For 2 decades, this was another haunting, unsolved murder. And in fact, it led to a huge investigation that was almost, not quite, but almost, on the scale of the World's End murders. It never quite entered into mythology quite the same way, but it was almost as big. I would love to talk more about this one and about all of them. Part of me doesn't like just blasting through these like a list. These women and girls, they weren't just footnotes to the World's End murders. Their lives were all of equal value. The crimes against them were all equally awful injustices. I'm just limited by time and the format of these podcasts. Don't think for a minute that by covering these deaths more in brief means that they are in any way of lesser importance. They're not. Angus Sinclair was convicted of the murder of Mary Gallagher in 2001 and given a life sentence with a punishment part of 17 years. That's a technicality because by that time he was already serving another life sentence, as we'll see. Although he never featured in the original investigation, he was connected so long after the fact because an incorrect tip-off in 2000 happened to lead to the case being reviewed, which led to the uncovering of both this surviving witness, the 11-year-old boy, by then a 34-year-old man, and a forensic sample that had fortunately remained usable for DNA. The DNA was able to undeniably link the crime to Angus Sinclair, who by then was in the database for other offences, and the eyewitness was able to give a clear identification and account of the events leading up to the murder. In court, the witness pointed out Sinclair as the man he and Mary had met on that lonesome path, and described how he'd afterwards lived in fear of Sinclair's eyes. He had eyes like dark holes, he said in court. If you've seen photographs of Angus Sinclair, particularly photographs of Angus Sinclair around the 70s and early 80s, you'll immediately know exactly what he was talking about. But that, as I say, was many years later. In 1978, Sinclair was far from done with offending. However, in the Gallagher murder, we do start to see a transition towards a different kind of sex crime. A move away from luring adult women and older girls away from night spots, killing them elsewhere and dumping them at a distance from where they were last seen, towards attacking younger, physically smaller, weaker victims more opportunistically in the environment in which he finds them. Why does this happen? Well, two things stand out. One is that, as I said, Sinclair sold his van after the Agnes Cooney murder. Apparently he was spooked by the descriptions of his vehicle in the press, and he just seemed to drop the whole idea of using a van as a kind of mobile murder mobile. So he's no longer as mobile in his crimes, he's no longer able to keep the victims alive for a long time, hours or days in Agnes's case, in a space that's under his control, and he's not able to whisk them far, far away. The other thing is, he has a huge falling out with Gordon Hamilton by this time, just before Hamilton's marriage to Wilma Sutherland, funnily enough. And they're no longer on speaking terms. Was it something to do with his marriage to Wilma Sutherland? Who knows? But they're no longer going so-called fishing together. Angus Sinclair is a physically small, not particularly imposing man. One of his assessments during that first prison sentence for Kathy Rehill's murder refers to him as a runt, which I think is great. He is, of course, able to kill and injure even other, fully grown adult men, but that's using weapons in a sudden frenzied shock attack. He's unlikely to be able to reliably control like a fully grown 5'8" or whatever woman over a long period, like he was perhaps when he had his bigger, stronger pal with him. As I say, from a distance, Mary, it seems, could almost have passed for a much younger child. Not long thereafter, Sinclair's victim profile, I'm sorry to say, would start to drift back to where it had started off in the early 60s, with solitary attacks on children. I think the fact that he had to change tactics when he broke off with Gordon Hamilton maybe speaks to just how many of these adult sex attacks Sinclair committed with Hamilton, just how big was his involvement. And now an outlier, or rather a glimpse into maybe another kind of murder that Sinclair may have been involved in. Edward Wee Eddie Cotonio was known to his neighbours as a quiet, polite, middle-aged bachelor who kept himself to himself. A Scottish-Italian wedding and portrait photographer and part-time night watchman, he lived in a flat in Dumbarton, just outside Glasgow, and ran a small photography studio and darkroom in Maryhill, ding ding ding. Since he didn't have a partner or a family, it seems he filled his time with work, Even at weekends, he kept himself busy running a small bric-a-brac store in the Barrowland market, selling antiques and knickknacks. The only thing that stood out about Eddie Cottonio, from the perspective of the folk living around him, the only thing that warranted a second thought, but probably not much more than that, was the fact that while he rarely socialised with his immediate neighbours, he was always seen in the company of different strangers. A surprising number of them women of varying ages and backgrounds, and one particular man, a short man with large, powerful looking hands and small, dark, piercing eyes. But there's nothing so strange about that, right? Wee Eddie is a man spinning a lot of plates. It's not surprising that so many people have business with him. In actual fact, Old Eddie was Glasgow's premier homegrown porno king.
Sorry.
Hidden behind the front of Eddie's antique business was probably the biggest porn supermarket in the Barras. And this being the 1970s, where in the UK hardcore pornography existed in, shall we say, a legally precarious position, it was sold kind of under the counter. Police turned a blind eye at times, and in some cases they took bribes to do so. But folk could and did go to jail on obscenity laws for selling material that was probably quite tame compared to what's out there today. At the same time though, because that whole industry existed in a semi-outlaw state, there wasn't always such a clear distinction between like vanilla dirty magazines, say, and things we today would recognise as more dark and harmful. The guys illegally selling pictures of consenting adults in sexual situations would often be selling those alongside content involving sexual violence or subjects below the age of consent. Because if they're all covered by the same blanket obscenity laws, in for a penny, in for a pound, that was a lot of the attitude, you know, for, say, crooked businessmen without a lot of scruples, shall we say. The point being, a porn dealership in the seedy 70s wouldn't always be like some upbeat, sexually liberated place. You know, don't picture some sort of carry-on setup. Oh, you know.
Kenneth Williams and Sid James kicking about.
Yeah, it could be quite nasty and grim business, and it could attract some quite nasty and grim people. Cottonio didn't just sell imported magazines and film loops though, he produced his own pornography on a considerable scale. For models, he would use ordinary women he met in the course of running his business. Some were would-be glamour models whom he convinced to go beyond lingerie and topless modelling with the old, you know, this'll help your career kind of creepy chestnut. Some were apparently women brought to him by a close associate called Gus, who would approach women he thought would be up for doing that and to whom Eddie would pay a finder's fee for the ones who agreed. So the vast majority of women he filmed and photographed nude or engaging in sexual activity were ordinary working class housewives, students, workers, daughters, mothers, just a cross-section of working class society. And some of them were married women. And fair enough, if that's what you want to do, no judgment. That's, you know, not a problem, as long as everyone's okay with it. But
and adults. Let's just stipulate that. Yeah.
And adults, of course, I should say, yeah. So when a police officer happened by Cottonio's flat on the 30th of July 1979 and saw smoke pouring from the window, and rushed in to find wee Eddie's brutally murdered corpse with pornographic photo prints piled atop him, and his flat set ablaze, the first assumption made by detectives was that he'd been killed by a jealous husband who'd found out about his wife's adult modelling career. However, their curiosity was also piqued when they heard about his associate Gus, a man who would trawl East End pubs trying to cajole women into doing porn shoots for the now deceased man. Gus was a guy they knew as a suspect never convicted in a number of violent robberies in both Glasgow and Edinburgh. You see, Gus's full name was Angus Sinclair, and Cottonio had had his skull bashed in with a hammer, one of Sinclair's signature moves. Now, it seems the pair had recently had a falling out. It's not perfectly clear why, but one strong and mind-boggling possibility was that Eddie, against Angus's wishes, had sold copies of photos of Angus in a compromising position with one of these models to some of his customers. So he then invaded Cottonio's home to retrieve the negatives and enact a bloody revenge. This would be lent some credibility by the fact that in a much later interview, Around the time of the World's End trials, Sarah Hamilton happened to mention that she'd once rowed with her husband Sinclair after finding what may have been professional shots of Angus having sex with another woman in Cotonio's studio. Sinclair likely had these taken for his own benefit, but Cotonio, if he made the prints, would probably have still been in possession of the negatives, because that's how that usually worked, and could have made as many copies as he wanted from those. The mind also wanders to other, even darker possibilities, especially when you consider the kinds of murders and atrocities Sinclair was later discovered to have been committing during the whole time of his association with Cotonio. Did Cotonio know too much about Angus's other activities? Was Angus producing child porn for Cotonio to sell? Were he and Hamilton taking photos of their victims while they were held captive in the Toyota Hiace and were taking them to Cotonio's lab to develop them privately?
As soon as you said that, that's what I thought. I was like, is he taking photographs of his victims before and after?
Absolutely. And from there, you can get into wild speculation about like snuff films, and you could easily springboard into some conspiracy land ideas from this, especially when you hear that around this time, Michael, the normally completely uncreative Sinclair displayed a sudden interest in photography and started accumulating camera equipment. So I'm not saying he was doing these things. I especially don't want to tar Cotonio too much with that brush, the brush of being maybe involved in these things. He's a victim here. There are innuendos about the sort of material he sold at the more extreme end, the ages of some of the subjects, shall we say, but it's entirely possible that that's just tabloid sensationalism. He was never convicted of anything like that, innocent till proven guilty. I'm just saying, seeing how many criminal pies Sinclair had his fingers in at once, plus the fact he seemed to be really good at finding accomplices willing to do awful things without ratting on him, you do find yourself wondering how far his activities and his associations go. How many co-conspirators don't we know about? Was it just Sinclair and Hamilton? Or were they just two out of a larger group? You could go really mad with that. What also creeps me out is that even discounting these possibilities, even if it was just a case of Cotonio was selling photographs of Angus he shouldn't have been, is the idea that, and I shouldn't laugh, but the idea that somewhere out there, someone's got porn photos of Angus Sinclair.
Aye.
Eddie Cotonio's murder was never officially solved. When police visited Sinclair immediately afterwards to question him, he said to his wife without missing a beat, they're here to ask about a friend that was killed, before they'd even told him what they were there for. Shortly after, Sarah would give an alibi to say that Angus had been with her at the time of the killing, and as a result of that, Sinclair was excluded from the investigation. Many years later, Sarah would admit Angus had harangued her into lending him a false alibi, and she'd been haunted by that ever since. At this time, Sinclair and Sarah's life together had mostly broken down. After having a son, Gary, in 1962, while things were still going well between them, they'd moved from Edinburgh to Glasgow for Sarah's nursing job, hence the shift in most of Sinclair's crimes to the Glasgow area, the main exception being the World's End murders. But by now, he was in and out of the family home. He would take off for weeks and shack up with other women. She would find out about affairs or get visits from the police about robberies he may have been involved in after he promised to her repeatedly that he'd never do those things again. Then after a few weeks he would come crawling back, and she'd take him back because she thought, mistakenly of course, but we can't really blame her for this as it was a widely held belief of the time, that having even a terrible role model like Angus around was better for her son than not seeing his father at all. Bearing in mind, she was unaware he was committing murders and sex crimes. She was aware he was visiting prostitutes, seeing other women, and that he was a person of interest in a number of armed robberies. She seems to have wanted to leave him as a result of all this, but as is the sad story that played out in the lives of many women of this time period, she felt trapped by duty and society's misguided idea of what was right for a child into letting this disruptive influence back into their lives time and again. But this would finally come to a hard stop on the 7th of June 1982 when Angus Sinclair was arrested for a string of sex attacks on young children. With hindsight, we can see Sinclair shifted MO with the loss of his van, with the loss of his main accomplice. He had somewhat changed tack, with the Mary Gallagher crime being possibly like a transitory phase between the two. In 1982, Sinclair was convicted of 11 rapes and crimes of indecency against children aged between 6 and 14. He did not murder these 11 victims, and in fact, and it's pretty gross, but he actually handed some of the money afterwards, as though that would somehow either buy their silence or somehow reduce the severity of the crime in some way. It was almost as though, in part, he was spooked by the amount of publicity his murders had caused, and so he was like trying something different. Ironically, these attacks were the ones that would be connected almost right away, while the murders would not be. They would maybe have attention individually, but they were not officially connected to one another until decades later. These attacks were committed in broad daylight, so not in the middle of the night. There were multiple witnesses, both the children themselves and the people who'd seen him fleeing the scene. In remand at Barlinnie prison just before his trial for this, his wife Sarah visited him for the last time. She told him they were finished, but if he had committed these crimes, he should plead guilty and not drag her, his 11-year-old son, and the victims themselves through the torment of a protracted trial. For perhaps the only time in his entire life, before or after, Angus decided to admit guilt for something, and he told her that yes, he had carried out the child sex offences that he was charged with, and then added something that would haunt her and everyone involved for many years. He told her that the accused crimes weren't even the tip of the iceberg of the things he'd done. And I can't help but feel, even with all we know now, decades later, we've only seen a few more % of that iceberg. Sinclair pleaded guilty and was convicted and given life imprisonment, which I think is a relatively satisfying, robust sentence for those crimes. You know, you hear all too often about child abusers getting non-custodial sentences or just getting a year or two. I think that, as you said in the last episode, that first murder committed when he was 16 against Kathy Rehill, the only murder they knew he'd been involved with at that time, was then taken into account at sentencing, and it showed a lifelong pattern of similar offending. Chillingly similar, in fact, because most of these 1980s attacks were carried out in tenement closes, just like with Kathy Rehill.
That's horrifying.
Yeah, awful. He was sent to Peterhead prison, Peterhead as it's pronounced locally, a grim, remote prison in the far northeast corner of Scotland, which is used to house the country's worst violent and sexual offenders. It's the best place for him, really. Over the years and the decades that followed, Sinclair outwardly managed to somewhat reinvent himself. He was very, very good at playing the game, very good at gaining the trust of prison authorities and getting on the good graces of other prisoners. Over time, he became a prison trustee, which is an inmate who's given jobs within the facility, allowed a lot more freedom to move around within the prison walls. He took up a job in the kitchen and then rose to the position of kitchen manager, and by all accounts, he ran the kitchens very, very well. It seems bizarre, but he was popular with the other prisoners, and eventually, because he was in there for so long, he became a sort of elder statesman in the prison. People would go to him for guidance in the same way, like at work, there might be like a particular union rep who's the go-to guy for employment advice, that kind of dynamic. And like Eddie Cottonio and that whole circle, the prison inmates and the guards all came to know Angus Sinclair as Gus. Now, of course, he wasn't allowed parole for many, many years, but he became eligible to apply for it in the late 90s. He did apply at least once, as far as I can tell. Thankfully, his request was denied. Then, in 2000 and 2001, came the cold case review of Mary Gallagher and Sinclair's additional conviction for her murder that we've already discussed. This came with an additional minimum term of 17 years, which meant that from that point, he could no longer apply for parole. Were it not for events that occurred later, he would have become eligible to apply again in 2018. I like to think that there would have been no chance of him succeeding in getting parole in 2018. I don't think they would have ever let him out, but you never know. Look at the Colin Pitchfork situation. Then, 3 years later, in 2004, Sinclair was finally linked, along with Gordon Hamilton, to the World's End murders, a series of events that we covered in the last episode. And infamously, this 2004 case against him collapsed when he successfully argued that he'd had consensual sexual contact with Helen Scott and Christine Eady, and no one could prove otherwise. hence the discovery of his DNA on their bodies along with Hamilton's, but that any violence must have been carried out by Hamilton later without Angus's knowledge. As absurd as this convoluted excuse for an account is, there was no way to prove it wasn't true. Scots law requires a case to be proven beyond reasonable doubt, and the involvement of the by now deceased Gordon Hamilton injected just enough reasonable doubt into the case. Sinclair's lawyer argued that if Sinclair's DNA had been found on the bindings used, that would have suggested his involvement in the killing, but no evidence like that existed. The trial was thrown out by the judge, who ruled that Sinclair had, quote, no case to answer. And at that stage, Angus Sinclair must have been pretty confident and pretty chuffed with himself that he would never face justice for the killings of Helen and Christine because of the principle of double jeopardy that states you can't stand trial for the same crime twice. Many countries around the world have this principle, as does Scots law. It seemed that no matter what new evidence came to light, bringing Sinclair back to trial on it would be a legal impossibility. However, in the years following the collapse trial, a couple of key things happened. Angus Sinclair's acquittal caused something of an uproar. Public opinion was very much against him, and this precipitated a big public debate about reforming double jeopardy law. Meanwhile, DNA forensics are continuing to progress in sophistication, right? Particularly in the area of low copy DNA. This is where genetic information is able to be gathered from much less potent sources. So, opposed to like blood, semen, or saliva, gathering it from stuff like skin cells you've left behind, or sweat or finger grease, the faintest of human traces.
There was a recent case where they'd said they'd found the smallest amount of DNA and extracted it, and
in a criminal case?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was, and that they were able to show that someone had... It was like an old cold case.
That's cool.
From what I read about it, they thought that maybe this would open up new avenues.
Yeah.
I think that's going to happen eventually. I think eventually it's going to be almost impossible to get away with a crime. You know?
I think so. Having said that, though, there is one problem to low copy DNA that I don't think is going to go away, and that is the fact that these sources, like the tiny amounts that it is, like the skin cells, that kind of thing, they're even more prone to degradation than traditional genetic sources. So simple exposure to air, daylight, bacteria, just basic environmental stuff will quickly make it unusable. So if there's a tiny amount of DNA there, it exists and it can be extracted for a while, and then it's just gone and there's nothing left to extract. And that was a problem in this case because 40 years near enough have expired, right? Exposure to air, daylight, bacteria, just basic environmental stuff. Where could low copy DNA from these crimes possibly have survived? And even if there was some place where it had miraculously been preserved, no matter how good the evidence, they still can't prosecute him again for the same crime. Then in 2007, following the election of the new SNP government to Holyrood, the incoming Cabinet Secretary for Justice, Kenny McCaskill, acutely aware of the ongoing controversy, ordered the Scottish Law Commission to conduct a review of, quote, the principle of double jeopardy and whether there should be exceptions to it. In 2009, the Commission published the recommendations, which included 3 proposed exceptions to be added to double jeopardy protections. 1, when the initial trial has been tainted by bribery, perjury, or where there's been a perversion of the course of justice. 2, where the previously accused has since made a credible confession. And 3, in cases where substantial new evidence comes to light after the trial when such evidence could not have been made available the first time. Following this, the Double Jeopardy Scotland 2011 Act would be written, passed, and received royal assent on 27th of April 2001. This law included the provision that these new exceptions could be applied retroactively. Okay, that's huge, an absolute huge change to the legal process. But even so, the green light to retry Sinclair only comes on if the prosecution can show that, quote, substantial new evidence. So, where is that coming from? The answer lay in the symmetrical reef knots Angus Sinclair had tied, the ones he had learned as a youth serving time for culpable homicide in Aberdeen prison, the ones he'd used to bind and strangle Christine Eadie The very same ones Sinclair's lawyer had referred to when he pointed out that none of his client's DNA was on those bindings, a fact that had been instrumental in bringing the initial trial to an end. Those knots had been stored in an evidence locker. Until now, the knots themselves had never been untied. The ligatures had been cut from the victims' bodies, but the knots themselves had been preserved in the centre of those expert, perfect knots, in the tightly bound centre where the fabric was protected from the elements, where no light had touched since 1977. Lester Nibb's team found their low-copy fingertip DNA, preserved by Sinclair's own skillful handiwork in tying them. On the 14th of November 2014, in the High Court of Justiciary, before Judge Lord Matthews and a jury of 15, Angus Sinclair was found guilty of the World's End murders. Helen Scott, Christine Eady, their families, friends and loved ones, at last, after nearly 40 years, had some measure of justice. Sinclair was sentenced to a further life sentence, with a minimum term of 37 years before being eligible for parole. He would have been allowed to apply for probation in the year 2051, when he would have been 106 years old. After this verdict, Angus Sinclair suffered a string of severe strokes and died in HMP Glenachill in 2018, aged 73, by which time he'd spent the majority of his life in jail. In some ways, it's a satisfying conclusion to a sorry and disturbing tale, certainly more so than some previous cases we've covered like Bible John or Pedro Lopez. It both is and isn't satisfying. Justice has been done for his most high-profile cases. He was convicted of 4 murders in his lifetime and about 12 separate sexual assaults. It's pretty much known that he killed somewhere in the region of 7 to 10 people at least. And again, I think there's probably more than that. I would say almost definitely. And most of their families don't have an actual conviction to show to give them resolution. I think there are certainly a lot more sex attacks and violent robberies as well, where people were scarred for life by him that were never prosecuted. Then you have the question of accomplices and comrades in murder. Was Gordon Hamilton the only one, or was he just the only one we know of? Are there more men out there now who committed serial murders in collaboration with this man? We know it happened once. We know he liked to offend with a friend, not to make a rhyme. When it came to different types of crime, that also rhymes. Then there's the overlap with the Bible John murders. Some have long suggested that those may not have all been the work of one man. Sinclair was out of prison for the Catherine Rehill murders by the time the Bible John murders occurred. There are a huge number of similarities in MO with Sinclair's crimes actually. Picking up women on a night out, using improvised ligatures, dumping them the way he did. Is it possible Peter Tobin committed 1 or 2 and Sinclair separately committed 1 or 2 and they just got lumped together as the work of one man? Or did they maybe know each other and was Tobin another one of Sinclair's
that's terrifying.
collaborators? There's a lot of commonalities between the pair of them. I don't want to start getting into it now because we could be here all night. But he had this propensity for involving others. The open-endedness of where he was going and what he was doing, that can all lead you down some bizarre, speculative paths. Like many men of his type, Sinclair went to his grave with secrets that would have answered the questions of many, many grieving families all over Scotland. So, although we have the satisfaction of a conviction for Helen and Christine, we're always going to be left with the haunting echoes of those who never got justice for what this animal did to them. I've spent about 2 months now researching and writing about every aspect of Angus Sinclair's life and crimes, and I'm glad to say this is the end of what I have to say about him, and I hope not to have to speak about him too much for a while.
Well done, mate. well done. Well done. Yeah, the amount of research you put in it can't be easy, kind of almost sitting in the world of people who are doing these sorts of things, you know, thinking about it a lot. And I think, like you say, it seems almost certain to me that there are other victims.
Yeah, he was so at home killing people.
Yeah.
He was just so casual about it.
And there would be plenty of opportunity for it. The idea of there being some sort of paedophile ring or something like that as well is terrifying. Was he involved in something like that? the fact that he had connections to a pornographer, and like you say, it may just be salacious, but was child pornography part of it? All of that is absolutely horrific. And I often think about these things. People sometimes think that, unfortunately, they think some of these things are like conspiracy theories. I know the more elaborate paedophile conspiracy theories that people talk about, but it's terrible to say, but there's a lot of it.
Yeah.
These people do seek each other out, and they seek...
Yeah, I'm not saying, in saying this, I'm not saying that this goes all the way to the Queen or something, I'm
Yeah, bring Angus in. Sorry.
I'm just saying that I think Sinclair was very, very good at finding people who were into the shit he was in. Somehow he was able to just see people for what they were. He was able to see who was into the stuff he was into and approach them without risk. In the same way that he was able to see who was a promising victim, perhaps.
I think they are kind of attracted to each other. They find each other. I'm thinking about a group of people that I know, right, or knew when I was younger. Not close friends or anything like that, but just people that I knew in the area where I grew up. They hung around together. And I know for a fact that one of them has been convicted of sex offences. And there was always stories about the other ones before then. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, even when it's not as terrible as that, even if it's something that's lower level, like I find that people that are willing to break into people's houses, for example, and steal things, tend to find each other. The really frightening thing about this case in particular is the idea that people who are that twisted and violent, they find each other, and the idea of there being other people that were as bad as him and they got away with it.
Yeah.
Like that idea's there. But I will say this, that I also knew growing up people who, it's weird, it's always something that I've thought about and it's always stuck with me. That old terminology, honour among thieves. Mm-hmm. There'd be groups of people who I would know that would be like in a gang, and I never, I knew all these people like through school, or I just happened to grow up a street away from them, and you just cross paths with them, and maybe when you were really younger, you played together or whatever, but there would be like a gang, and it would be like, if they had found out there was someone in their group, even if it was someone that they loved dearly, who had raped someone or something like that, then that would be the end of that person.
Yeah.
If someone's going to be that manipulative, that psychopathic, and that twisted, they're going to have to be able to negotiate situations that are exceptionally dangerous for them, because if they approach the wrong person and think, well, this person's like me, and all of a sudden that person's like, well, do you know what? I was abused as a kid, so I'm going to do something terrible to you now.
Yeah. What also I think is weird about the case is that he seems to have been involved in so much. He seems to have been so prolific. Nobody really knows Angus Sinclair. He's not, even now in Scotland, and World's End murders are still a recognisable name for an event that happened. Not as many people recognise the name Angus Sinclair if you say it.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is he seemed to have avoided notoriety for what he did. Even during his life, even he murdered a little girl and then was able to walk out of prison, and nobody really kind of picked up on it. Some people had suspicions what he'd been in for, like his wife's brother, the one that didn't get along with him, called him a nonce and stuff. But it wasn't really, I suppose at that time we wouldn't have the internet to look it up. It would have been newspaper reports. But guy was a child killer. Like even just doing that once, I think, usually would be enough to make your name dirt. How did he avoid that his whole life and just kind of blend in? He was quite liked. Nobody seemed to suspect him. It was just quite weird. But that lack of notoriety is interesting.
It might be symptomatic of, like you say, number one, how manipulative he could be, but number two, how child death especially was treated back then.
Maybe.
I don't know if there was just certain things that publicly people didn't want to face.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, it's possible.
And then there was the explosion in the 80s, especially in Scotland.
Like Robert Black and all of this, yeah.
Of the idea that, paedophilia, for example, is something that's more common than you think. And then, it may have been that people didn't want to face up to someone in your community, someone that you played with when you were a kid is capable of that.
Yeah. I think that's as well what happens with his wife. She had sort of some idea that he was in for something shameful, and never really broached the subject. Didn't really, almost like...
That's nuts in itself.
Not that she didn't want to know, but just didn't really want to face the idea that her husband was a monster.
Yeah.
Because it's difficult. It's difficult to face that truth, especially when you've got a kid with them. And incidentally, Angus Sinclair's son was also convicted of murder.
No way, really?
But not in anything like the same circumstances. He joined the army, he was a squaddie, and he got in a fight somewhere down in England. And after the fight, he ran and hid from the police in someone's back garden, and then a guy came by and saw him and, I don't know, started shouting at him, and he apparently headbutted him, cracked his skull off the ground and killed him. But then he doesn't seem to be like a psychopath, he just seems to have been someone on a kind of violent path, because what sort of upbringing is that to, at the age of 11, discover that your dad, you know, has been molesting children, and, you know, that must have fucked the poor guy up.
Wondering if it's in you.
That must have had some horrible impact on him. Angus Sinclair doesn't seem to have anything particularly bad in his childhood.
Yeah.
His son does, you know.
I doubt it, though. Do you really think things didn't happen to Angus Sinclair?
I think things probably did, but were they that much worse than was kind of semi-common at the time? Not excusing it, but you hear about people like Richard Ramirez, whose childhoods were atrocious, and his uncle came back from Vietnam and showed him pictures of people he'd chopped up, and, you know, awful stuff. And I don't think there's anything on that scale, certainly, with Sinclair. You know, he maybe, I don't know, maybe this next door neighbour, maybe there was some abuse.
He never uses an excuse, no matter what.
But yeah, he's one of the worst, man. He's fucking awful. He's awful.
Let's just fucking consign him to the shite bin. But
yeah. In you go, Angus. In you go.
You did a great job going through all of that, and it's absolutely horrific. Let's do some more upbeat topics for a while.
Yeah. Before we go, I want to say a quick hello to our Twitter friends who've said hello or retweeted our stuff. Strassa, or Estrassa, sorry if I pronounced that wrong. Christina Barton, who I think is probably our most reliable supporter on Twitter. Thanks, Christina. Lizard in a Tree, and Robert Craig Morgan, who I believe used to be in Grange Hill back in the day.
Oh, amazing.
Amazing. We're really grateful to have you folks flying the flag for Talking Till Dawn. It really means a lot, guys and girls. Thank you. And with that, Michael, unless you've got anything else that you'd like to say, I think I see the sun coming up.
The sun is most definitely coming up, my friend.
Good night.